Hey, y'all. This is Sam from the Roots of Change podcast, and I believe we are live currently on LinkedIn. And I am here with Joe Cardillo. We are back to talk about tech, politics, and organizing. Today, we are talking about all of the news. There's a lot going on, but we also are going to really dig into kind of the global part of the politics and how we can move in this moment and how we can learn from organizers and movements across history and across the globe today and in the past. So, just to kick us off, we wanted to kind of dig into some of the news items and really understand them on a social change lens. We often see the media kind of repeating these phrases, and Joe, you're a disinformation expert. So, I'm not sure if you want to kind of give any preamble of like how we are looking at the news and how we kind of understand headlines when we know that the media is not always on the level in some occasions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I won't go super deep, but I think one thing that we should keep watching for is, sort of the psychological warfare tactics of, what's essentially propaganda that's coming down from the federal government, because that's really making its way into the news ecosystem a lot. Um,
Yeah.
so we have to keep watching for that. And I won't say too much about it other than that, there's a lot of misalignment and misframing and just straight up lying and falsehoods too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think our first news item kind of illustrates that in terms of like what is real and what is not real. And I talked about this on the podcast last week around resegregation and how we talk about the economy and who is really in reality and how if you're not really living in the current reality and understanding how the Trump administration is moving, then it's going to be really hard to have the right analysis. But when we look at the Wisconsin Supreme Court race that just was called this Tuesday, that was a huge win for folks on the left, or I guess anti fascists at this point, anyone that is against fascism. Because, as we know, Elon Musk was putting a ton of money into that race. He was giving away $1 million checks for people to vote. And they were explicitly saying, I voted because Elon Musk gave me this check. Um, and so there's a lot of like this noise of them feeling bigger than they are. And I think this Wisconsin Supreme Court race and the results where the left progressive slash liberal judge won by, I think it was 10 points. Um, that was a huge election victory against Elon Musk, against Donald Trump. And that is showing that the public is not for a lot of these policies.
Yeah. And I would say, I think, it illustrates like, yeah, and you mentioned kind of at the top, like what is sort of the stuff that's coming through a lot of news platforms versus like what's really actually happening. Like there's actually quite a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance to these policies. And, like tariffs are widely understood to be a tax, which is exactly what they are. When you know, enact tariffs, goods and services cost more. Guess who pays more for those goods and services? It's you, me, and everyone else. So there's a wide understanding when we look at data and polling that tariffs are taxes, and people are not real happy about that. And in fact, the tariffs that were just announced are going to cost. There's a couple of economic, sort of looks at it, but on average, about $3,800 per American household per year. And looking at an American populace where something around, I can't quite remember the number, but around half of the populace does not have any savings at all. And I've been there, done that. I have just a little bit now, but I can relate to that problem. $3,800 is not a small amount. So using that as an example, like I think that doing a bunch of really harmful, bad stuff to a lot of people, and then saying this is great and it's going to make our country amazing. Like I think there's even regardless of the amount of sort of framing and the news releases and the social media content and just like all the nonsense, like you can't really tell people who are getting thunked on the head like, oh no, you're not getting thunked on the head, that's actually really good for you. Like that
Yeah.
disconnect is rising, I think, clearly.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's like a huge opportunity for us on the left is to like crack those moments. And yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted to get into the economic and the tariffs. Today we're seeing the market crash again, and obviously not all of us own stocks, but it's a good indicator because a lot of wealthy folks own stocks, and they are the ones that are acquiescing to Trump. And I think there is a shift that's happening because of this larger tariff. Like, we were having the like Mexico Canada tariff and really negotiating with a lot of different specific businesses. And now you're seeing them much broader across larger swaths of the globe. And I think, one is a pay to play performance of like, hey, if you don't want a tariff on your company, then you got to play with Trump. And that's, the mafia style of this administration. But the other piece of that is the economy and our daily lives and how we're like the public will be impacted by this, and we're already seeing that. And no matter the stories, like people can feel that. And so a lot of it is like, how can we make sure that we're tying that back to the policies that Trump is doing and enacting?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, if you look at, you know, a lot of the, early signs of sort of how are people receiving all of the federal cuts and layoffs and, look, I mean, cutting social security support so that you can't call a customer service representative and get help with your claim, like just like getting rid of that completely. And then also just crashing the login for Social Security Administration, which happened a bunch over the last week. um, you know, you can't really sugarcoat that. There's not really any amount of spin that's going to change the devastation or impact of that. And then also, when you look at like, layoffs and cuts and disruption to federal workers, which is really actually quite harmful here in New Mexico and mostly in the rural. I mean, it's not great anywhere, but in the rural parts of New Mexico, federal workers provide essential services and support. And so all those kinds of things that are happening, I think the pain is starting to really sort of set in for people, and I have a lot of empathy for it. It's not great. I mean, it puts a lot of people in a really tenuous position. And I think just being really clear about what those impacts are to communities is really important, and staying focused on that over sort of the hysteria of like national politics.
Yeah, yeah, definitely focusing on like the impact to people and communities. And so much of this is its own wealth redistribution. Like all of this, the way that Trump talks about tariffs is actually like he does believe what he's saying, because when he is saying Trump's tariffs are a tax, and they're a revenue driver, well, they're a revenue driver for him because his whole goal right now is try to clear enough money out of the federal government so that they can enact their tax cuts on the wealthy. So tariffs actually do help with that in some, you know, addled brain. But like, back to living in reality versus living in an addled brain, the reality was, and I'm not going to defend the Biden economy, there was way too much, just the economic inequality was stark. And while he was making progress, it was not enough. But there was a lot of talk at the end of the last year around the success of the US economy in the 4 or 5 years after the pandemic and how successful we were in comparison to other countries. And now all of that has been wiped away. And so I don't know, I don't think a lot of us are really prepared for how that is going to shape and how the world is going to react to that. And so I would love to kind of turn it over to the global piece of it all, um, and how we're seeing JD Vance, we're seeing Elon Musk really use a lot of the tactics that we've seen in other parts of the globe in the past 10 few decades. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and how we can learn from other regions of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two pieces. Like one that I think we have to be really straightforward about, which is like all of this sort of really chaotic and harmful stuff that the Trump administration is doing to the American people is also happening externally to other places. So, there's a lot of examples, but you know, the Ukraine example is a great one of like sort of strong arming, trying to take all the valuable minerals in Ukraine, basically saying like we're not going to do business with anybody unless you do exactly what we say all the time, whenever we want. Which you made the kind of the mafia mob reference, which I think is appropriate to our foreign policy choices right now. So I think it's important to say that one, like we're not perceived as the good guys anymore. And it is getting much worse, much faster than anybody could imagine. Like people are not looking at the US, with all the complications of looking at the Western world and saying, you know, I don't, it's a mixed picture. It's not like we were sort of amazing and the bastion of
Yeah,
goodness.
I was gonna say.
Yeah, it's like, there's a lot we could go into there. I'm not going to talk about that, but we are definitely, our perception is getting worse of the US around the world. And that has pretty serious consequences because when your allies don't trust you, um, and then the people who are like outside of your ally circle see you destroying your closest allies like Mexico, Ukraine, Canada, etc. They are taking a note from that. And I think, going back to kind of the second piece, when we look at countries that have been able to, sort of deal with authoritarian regimes, Poland, the Philippines, Brazil has had a very sort of aligned parallel path. Both the communication choices that people make and the actual organizing are very much like low on the ground worker cooperative organized work. So
Mhm.
pro democracy movements, and we're seeing that even in Hungary and Serbia right now, where people are really moving differently and communicating differently, and um, that's something that we're going to have to get used to doing because it's we're under a different era now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I talked a little bit about that in the private pod last week, around the Signal chat and and all of that of like privacy for me and not for thee. And like we really need to be aware if we are moving against any of these institutions and these governments that they are working to make sure that we do not have any privacy, and so, learning from these groups is extremely helpful for us right now. And I think there's a lot of like international solidarity and cooperatives that we can learn from. I know you wanted to get a little bit into Bolsonaro and Brazil. One of the things that I was talking about over Women's History Month in our newsletter was the Las Nuestras Unidas, which was the larger mass movement in other parts of Latin America and South America against feminicide and just sexual and gender based violence. And how a lot of that started in small local communities, just through talking, through sharing conversations, through sharing experiences. And especially now, as like women, queer folk, we are being targeted and we can have stories, and it can be that connective tissue of like, I experienced that too. Maybe I'm not the only one, and maybe we can build more solidarity if we know that we're more connected than we realize.
Yeah, and I think, it's like the phrase know your role kind of comes to mind too, in the sense of each person's sort of gifts or talents or area of expertise is really important, and then also being consistent is really important. Like using the example of Brazil, in sort of pushing back on Bolsonaro and his sort of brutal thug authoritarian regime. They, one of the things that organizers did really well was sort of figure out what are the levels of kind of influence that exist in Brazil. And so like the example was like the first layer or level was sort of the communities that people belong to. That's the family group chat, that's the church, that's the place that you go, the third space, like a coffee shop, a library, co-working space. Those are all really close, important spaces. And then, like another level might be more what we're all familiar with, our favorite social media page, Instagram page that we check every day because it's hilarious or whatever. Um, you know, podcasts that we pay attention to on a regular basis, things that we kind of subscribe to that we feel we have a connection to. And then the third level is sort of like that, but stuff that comes into our view because our friends and other people, refer it in. And so like just being aware of kind of the levels of influence, I think is really important. All three of those things are
Mhm.
very different and require different kinds of work and also require consistency. And, like in the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil, like these organizers did a really great job of making sure that if you were hearing about something in your church group or your WhatsApp family channel, that you also were seeing it in that second layer and that third layer, like the way that they, really intentionally kind of disseminated information and worked with, people across those levels was really important. And I think that also reflects like it's such a saturated work, information environment that like consistency and strategy are really important.
Yeah, yeah. No, I appreciate that example because it's like the the consistency and also like the layering and like for me, I think a lot about the layers of trust within those layers. Because obviously from both sides also I would say like trusting for yourself and your own mental health, because that's really important in this time, but also like do these people in this community, this circle, trust, and so obviously your closest circle is going to be your most trusted people, so theoretically you can be yourself and you can be a little bit more vulnerable in that group, which is really important when we're in these moments and we start sharing stories and we start sharing experiences, because then we can put the macro part into the micro. We can see like, oh yeah, my friend lost their job at the nonprofit, and like my other friend was talking about their grant funding getting cut, and then all of a sudden those pieces get put together and you start to realize the larger macro picture, and then that's when you can start like having those disparate conversations across the layers. um, and again, like the trust in the messaging, like that's something that I think a lot about there is like we can be really straightforward with our communities. Like you get to like you just to throw up and be like, what's up? Like you're not showing up the way that I feel like you should. What's going on? You can have those conversations. Whereas online, it's really hard to have those nuanced conversations. And so it's like, what is the messaging that you're putting out there on social, and how is it helping you? Is it helping, your ultimate mission, which is, hopefully to dismantle some of these systems. And so like, I really think about that kind of weaving of the different spheres of influence. All right. Well, until next time, y'all stay rooted.